More than 30 years on from the disaster that made its name infamous, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant still holds an uneasy fascination for many. The events of April 1986 have recently been dramatized in a HBO series. But what really happened? And why did it send shockwaves throughout the world? The Soviet Union invested heavily in nuclear power after World War II, and the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station, 10 miles to the north of Chernobyl, had become operational in 1977. There were 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site, each capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electric power. On the night of the 25th of April 1986, sleep-deprived plant workers ran a series of tests on Reactor 4 during a period of routine maintenance. They wanted to see whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. But they violated safety protocols and several power surges occurred inside the reactor. It led to a chain reaction of explosions powerful enough to blow off the steel and concrete lid. With the reactor's core exposed, radioactive material spewed into the atmosphere. Official reports claimed that 2 plant workers died in the initial explosion, but some estimates put the number closer to 50. Dozens of firefighters called in to extinguish the flames were also hospitalized with radiation sickness. With the Cold War still going on, the Soviet Union did all it could to avoid the disaster gaining international attention. It was 36 hours until orders were issued for the neighbouring town of Pripyat, built for plant workers in 1970, to be evacuated. By the time airborne radioactivity was being picked up at Swedish monitoring stations, the Soviets could no longer sustain secrecy around the event. They made a brief announcement on April the 28th, and an outcry over the dangers posed by radioactive emissions began in many Western European countries. To contain the fire blazing in the exposed core, sand, boron, clay and lead were dropped onto the flames. The Soviets then tried clearing debris with remote-controlled robots, but when the machines started breaking down in the toxic atmosphere, groups of men were brought in to clear 100 tons of radioactive material from the area. Later in the year, the first steel sarcophagus was built to contain the plant's 4th reactor. Despite being structurally unsound, it would remain in place until 2016, when a new container was built. Even with this protection, it's estimated the zone around the reactor itself will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. The Soviet Union eventually established a 19-mile-wide exclusion zone around the reactor, uprooting some 335,000 people. Nevertheless, a UN report asserted that more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the incident. Hundreds of thousands of people may ultimately have been affected. On top of this, it's estimated the disaster cost some $235 billion in damages. It contaminated almost 1/4 of agricultural land in modern Belarus and hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. Other than a few scientists and tourists intrigued by Chernobyl's history, the zone around the power plant is now eerily quiet and remains off-limits to anyone without a permit. Even today, the full scale of the disaster isn't fully understood and remains an area of active research.
The first part of the rods that enter the core are the graphite tips, and when they do, the reaction in the core, which had been rising, skyrockets. Every last molecule of liquid water instantly converts to steam, which expands and ruptures a series of fuel rod channels. The control rods in those channels can move no further. The graphite tips are fixed in position, endlessly accelerating the reaction. Chernobyl Reactor 4 is now a nuclear bomb. 1:23:42. Perevoschenko looks down on the enormous steel lid of the reactor and sees the impossible. The control rod and fuel channel caps, which each weigh 350 kilograms, are jumping up and down. He runs to warn the control room. but there's nothing he can do to stop what is coming. 1:23 and 44 seconds. The steam blows more fuel channels apart. We do not know how high the power went. We only know the final reading. Reactor 4, designed to operate at 3,200 megawatts, went beyond 33,000. The pressure inside the core can no longer be held back. At long last, we have arrived. 1:23:45, explosion. In the instant the lid is thrown off the reactor, oxygen rushes in. It combines with hydrogen and superheated graphite. The chain of disaster is now complete.
To understand how this could happen, we have to first look at life in Pripyat before that night. Pripyat was not a struggling, forgotten town. It was a model Soviet city, built in 1970 to house workers of the Chernobyl plant and their families. It had all signs of prosperity: wide tree-lined boulevards, schools, hospitals, sports centres, and modern apartment blocks. There were shops stocked with goods, cafes where friends met for coffee, and cinemas where children watched the latest films. People lived comfortably compared to many parts of the USSR. At the heart of the city stood the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a massive industrial complex with 4 working reactors and 2 more under construction. This was the pride of Soviet engineering, producing enough electricity to power millions of homes. But behind that pride lay a dangerous truth. The RBMK 1000 reactor design had critical flaws that only a small number of Soviet engineers were aware of. The rest of the country saw the reactors as a shining example of progress and technological might. On April 25, 1986, a safety test was scheduled for reactor number 4. The idea was simple in theory: simulate a power outage to see if the plant's turbines could keep generating enough electricity to run the cooling pumps until backup generators kicked in. The test had been done before, but never succeeded as planned. Officials in Moscow were pushing for results, and the engineers on duty were under pressure to deliver. The test was supposed to take place during the day shift, but a series of delays meant it was postponed into the late evening. This would prove to be one of the many critical flaws in what was to come. By the time the test began, the night shift crew, less experienced and unfamiliar with some of the procedures, were in charge. To run the test, operators had to reduce the reactor's power level, but when they did, a sudden drop in reactivity caused the power to plummet far below the intended level. This was a dangerous situation because a nuclear reactor operating at low power can become unstable. The operators, following flawed procedures and under immense pressure, tried to bring the power up by removing most of the control rods, long boron-filled rods that regulate the nuclear reaction. This left the reactor in a precarious state, with a high buildup of steam and reactivity. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, the test began. The turbines were shut down to simulate a power loss, and within seconds the reactor's unstable conditions spiraled out of control. The combination of design flaws, operator error, and unsafe procedures caused a massive spike in power. Operators hit the emergency shutdown button known as AZ5, but in the RBMK design, this action actually made things worse. The graphite tips of the control rods briefly increased reactivity as they entered the core. In less than 5 seconds, the reactor's output surged to over 100 times its normal power. This was far beyond what it was built to handle. A series of explosions tore through the reactor vessel, blowing off the 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid and hurling it into the air. The core was now exposed to the atmosphere, and burning graphite from inside the reactor began to spew radioactive material high into the night sky. The blast was so powerful that it was heard miles away, but many in Pripyat simply thought it was a minor industrial accident. Few could imagine the scale of what just happened. The immediate aftermath inside the plant was chaos. Fires broke out across the facility and radioactive debris littered the roof and surrounding areas. Firefighters from Pripyat rushed to the scene without any protective gear, believing they were putting out a simple electrical fire. They were unaware that the smoke and dust swirling around them carried lethal doses of radiation. Many of these men would suffer severe radiation burns within hours, their skin rending and blistering, and falling off, their strength fading. Several would die within weeks from acute radiation sickness, their heroism remembered only years later when the truth came to light. In the control room, confusion reigned. Many operators refused to believe the reactor had exploded. In the Soviet Union, the idea that such a disaster could happen to one of their most advanced reactors was unthinkable. Some believed it was just a rupture in the cooling system or a hydrogen explosion, not realizing the core itself was destroyed. Meanwhile, radiation levels were already soaring to deadly levels, far beyond the range of the plant's measuring equipment. Instruments maxed out, giving readings that appeared almost normal compared to the actual danger. By the early morning hours, radioactive particles began drifting over Pripyat. The city awoke to an unusually warm, bright day. Children went to school, people shopped in markets, couples strolled in the park. There was no official warning, though some residents noticed a strange metallic taste in the air and experienced headaches or nausea. Others saw columns of smoke rising from the plant and wondered why helicopters were circling overhead. In reality, the cloud over Pripyat was carrying iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes, each capable of causing long-term health damages. It was not until the next day, over 24 hours after the explosion, that Soviet authorities finally began evacuating the city. Buses arrived in long lines and residents were told they would be gone for only a few days. People left behind pets, personal belongings, even food still cooking on stoves. They had no idea that they would never return. Pripyat became a ghost city, frozen in time, its streets, schools and homes abandoned forever. Outside the Soviet Union, news of the disaster began to leak when radiation detectors at a Swedish nuclear plant picked up unusually high readings. The Swedes demanded an explanation, and the Soviet government was forced to admit that an accident occurred, but even then, they downplayed its severity. It would take weeks for the full scale of the catastrophe to be revealed. Over the following days and weeks, a massive cleanup operation began. Workers known as liquidators were brought in from across the Soviet Union to contain the disaster. They worked in shifts of only a few minutes near the core, shoveling radioactive debris off rooftops, building a concrete sarcophagus around the destroyed reactor, and decontaminating surrounded areas. Many of them received dangerous doses of radiation, and countless would suffer from related illnesses in the years to come. The Soviet Union deployed over 500,000 people in the cleanup effort, one of the largest industrial mobilizations in history. The environmental and human cost of Chernobyl was staggering. Radioactive fallout spread across Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and into Europe, contaminating farmland, forests, rivers, and towns. Entire villages were evacuated and left to decay. In Belarus, some areas received more contaminations than parts of Ukraine itself. Estimates of the number of people who eventually died as a result of the disaster vary widely. Official Soviet figures claim just 31 immediate deaths, but modern studies suggest thousands of cancer cases and other health issues were caused by the radiation exposure. Chernobyl also had a profound political impact. It exposed the deep flaws in the Soviet system, the secrecy, the denial, the failure to admit mistakes. It eroded public trust and became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked state power. For many historians, Chernobyl was one of the events that weakened the Soviet Union in its final years, contributing to its eventual collapse in 1991. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone covers over 2,600 square kilometers. Nature has reclaimed much of the area, with forests growing through cracked roads and wild animals roaming freely where once humans lived. The city of Pripyat stands as a haunting time capsule, its Ferris wheel rusting in the wind, schoolbooks still lying on desks, toys scattered in empty playgrounds. Reactor number 4 is now encased in a massive steel structure designed to contain the remaining radiation for the next 100 years. But the land around it would remain dangerous for far longer. In some cases, thousands of years. The story of Chernobyl is not just about one night in 1986. It's a reminder of the fragility of our technology and the consequences of ignoring safety for the sake of speed or politics. It's about the bravery of those who fought to contain the disaster and the countless lives changed by something they could not see, smell, or touch. And it is about the truth and how it can be hidden, twisted, or delayed, but eventually it emerges. The name Chernobyl will forever be a warning to the world of what happens when human ambition collides with nature's unforgiving laws. Even decades later, scientists continued to study the long-term effects of the disaster. Radiation hotspots remain in the zone, and the wildlife there provides clues about how ecosystems adapt to such extreme contamination. Tours are now allowed into certain areas, drawing visitors from around the world who want to see the ghost city with their own eyes. Some come out of curiosity, others out of respect for those who suffered and sacrificed. Walking through Pripyat today is like stepping into a photograph frozen in time, a reminder of how quickly normal life can vanish. Chernobyl was not the first nuclear accident, and sadly it will not be the last, but it stands apart because of its scale, its secrecy, and the haunting images it left behind. It's a story that I personally believe needs to be told and retold, not just as a piece of history, but as a lesson for the future. For as long as we harness the power of the atom, the shadow of Chernobyl will loom over us, urging us to respect the forces we cannot fully control, and never will.